Robert Buccellato joins us. He has written a second book now. Last year it was Florida Governors and Their Lasting Legacies, or Florida Governors' Lasting Legacies. Outstanding book that we talked about extensively at the Squeeze. And first off, I should ask you, how did that book sell, and what was the response to it?
The book sold. It sold surprisingly well. The publisher was pretty happy about it. They didn't think that it was going to sell as well as I think this one's going to sell. But everybody seemed to like it. It was written to be a book that could be sort of a jumping off point to people who are not familiar with the subject matter, and anybody who wants a sort of refresher course on Florida government history and governors could be able to pick it up. And that seems to be what everybody thought of it. Overall, it was pretty successful, although I'd probably say the appeal is far more marginal than this second book, which has more of a national setting.
Right, so let's transition to that. Obviously, you're a Florida boy. Your grandfather served with distinction in the state legislature, actually a legend from South Florida, Walt C. Young, and you live in Wakulla County. You're the historian at the clerk's office in Tallahassee. So the governor's book was very much in your wheelhouse. Talk a little bit about what prompted you to get involved with President Jimmy Carter and write this book.
All right. Well, when I graduated community college, I had about a 6 months lull in between when I started FSU and when I, ended TCC. And, I was working, but, I had a lot more free time. So I had always been interested in the 1976 election, in Jimmy Carter. I think because my grandfather and him are about the same age, and also because Jimmy Carter was the only Democratic president that the Golden Age legislators, the Democrats, had. And as a result, he was the only president that my granddad had sort of that the array of presidential mementos that you would typically find in a politician's home. I always see the Jimmy Carter inaugural programs and pens and stuff like that. But I was also drawn from the time I was a kid to the notion that Jimmy Carter was, one, an outsider, two, that he was an unlikely president who succeeded. And so there was this air of possibility, of potential, of anything is not only possible, but it's reasonable and it's attainable if you work hard and if you're dedicated. So I was always fascinated in the material, and I decided I have this period before I start my bachelor's. I'm gonna start researching a book, and I decided to book on the 1976 election, and that's where I started calling up all the people that were still alive who ran for president. That was when I talked to Walter Mondale, most of Carter's cabinet, Senators Burt Bayh, Fred Harris, all of these people. Carl Sanders, who was governor of Georgia before Jimmy Carter, just really a wealth of people. All the surviving people on the Ford campaign. And when I finally went into college at FSU, I had about 8 to 10 hours of interviews from all of these different people. And then while I was in college, I started, I kind of put that off, and I started working more closely with Florida, and I ended up doing the Florida Governors, and I wrote my book on McCarty, which will be coming out in about a year. And then once I sort of finished these other projects, I said, well, I think it might be time to sort of dig this up. And so I started working on a book about Jimmy Carter in Plains, Georgia, a full-length book, which I will eventually publish probably in about 2 years. I'm talking to some publishers about it now. It's about, I'd say 90,000 words right now. But it was during all of that research that I came upon an individual named Charles Plant, who was my age during the 1976 election. And he was an amateur photographer who was born in South Georgia and raised in South Georgia, and he got caught up in the 1976 election. And he ended up being one of the only photographers who got Secret Service clearance. So he had these wonderful, amazing photos. And he was actually the filmmaker who made the campaign documentary that they played, the Park Service plays in the campaign depot, the train depot in Plains, which is where Carter ran his campaign. And I connected with him. He, first of all, same question as you. He said, well, you did nothing but Florida. Why? And you are not connected to this. You weren't born then. Why are you interested? And I finally told him, how enthusiastic I was and how this was a dream of mine. And I don't know if I convinced him or if he just felt so sorry for me that my dream was to write a book on Jimmy Carter, but he ended up giving me all of these fantastic images that are available in the book.
And those images are incredibly rich. The book is Jimmy Carter in Plains, the presidential hometown. And talk about, from your trained mind, you're a trained historian, you do this for a living. As you look through these images that Mr. Plant provided you with, and as I flip through the book, which will be available, by the way, on February 1st in bookstores and online. So it's available online already, but doesn't ship till February 1st. That Jimmy Carter, so much of his style was folksy, it was down to earth, it was retail. And we still even see that in his work abroad, the missions he takes to Africa, all of the humanitarian work he's done. I can't help but think when I flip through, especially the initial chapters of the book, and the small town South Georgia type of setting which Plains provides, that might have been a critical component in why Jimmy Carter, in a year where there was a lot of cynicism, obviously coming after Watergate in Vietnam, was able to go to Iowa and New Hampshire and win those critical contests and go on and become president in 1976. And I think just from even looking at these photographs, I understand why he was so effective in New Hampshire and Iowa more than I did before I had this book.
Well, and I do want to touch on one thing. This book, the photo book that I decided to make, which I decided once I had all these images that it would be sort of a visual companion to this other book on Plains that I'm writing. It was the determination of me and Charles Plant and the photographer that this would come out around this time, not only to serve as a tribute to the 40th anniversary of the election of Jimmy Carter, but also because this is the time of the Iowa caucus, which is when the book actually comes out. But this was also the month of February also is the 40th anniversary of his victory in New Hampshire. And what we're trying to sort of symbolize here in all of these, I'd say all of these sort of anniversaries, in our own benign ways, we're trying to sort of remind people of the quality of candidate that you should aspire to vote for. And that there is a long legacy, not just of Jimmy Carter, but of many presidents, of individuals that are humbling themselves to connect with people individually. And that's one of the appeals of Iowa and New Hampshire. And I think we've seen a lessening of that because money has become such a huge contributor of determining who wins presidential elections. And At the time, Jimmy Carter really didn't have a chance because of all of the post-Whitewater legislation and campaign finance legislation. He was limited to $25 million in the primary and $25 million in the general. He and Gerald Ford spent as much nationally as Richard Nixon spent in his home state of California 4 years before. So there was a huge reduction in ad buying. So they had no choice but to try and not only connect to people on a personal message, a personal basis, but they had to do it in a positive, upbeat manner. And if you look at all of the huge array of ads that these two men were trying to unleash to the American public, it's all positive. And another thing that Jimmy Carter did was when he was traveling in the early stages of the campaign, he didn't stay in hotel rooms. He stayed in the homes of people that were either supportive to his candidacy or at least interested in his candidacy. And he had people from Plains that were called the Peanut Brigade that were his friends and neighbors and family come to these early states on their own money and go up to people and essentially preach the values of Jimmy Carter and his vision of America.
You have several photographs in here from Mr. Plant of Lillian Carter, and I've heard so much about her, Jimmy Carter's mother, through the years, and the influence she was on his way of thinking. She's just one of those classic examples of humanitarian-oriented Southern women who, in fact, she volunteered for the Peace Corps when she was in her 60s. Talk a little bit about her influence on both Jimmy Carter, the governor, and then Jimmy Carter, the presidential candidate. Oh, and I should say on all three things, Jimmy Carter, the president, as well.
Well, I'll say that for the first 25, 30 years of Jimmy Carter's life, he, in my opinion, he had sort of a psyche tug-of-war between his mother and his father. He wanted to emulate his father in the professional capacity, in a business aspect, in a business mentality, because his father towered over the community, and he was also a product of the Jim Crow South, a fiercely staunch conservative and a firm believer in segregation. So Jimmy Carter, I think from a young age, admired his father and wanted to emulate him, but at the same time, he took after his mother and his mother's father, who was a postmaster and a Republican in that area. And both of them were politically very knowledgeable, but they were also very liberal in their views of segregation and of civil rights. And his mother, Rosalind Carter used to say, would be the only person that would defend Abraham Lincoln. And she, at a time when women just did not work.
And that was a brave thing to do in southern Georgia. I can't imagine.
Absolutely. In some parts, I don't think they admit it openly, but in some parts it still is. There's a few little pockets of Georgia where I think they're still a little bit hostile to aid. But at a time when women just did not work, she told her husband, I'm going to finish my nursing whether you like it or not. And she was a completely independent woman, just absolutely independent. She had a line of pecan trees that every year she would harvest with help from her children. She wouldn't accept any help from her husband or his laborers, and then she would sell them, and she wouldn't give them a dime. That was her money. She was just a fiercely independent person. and she would openly